Hi, so today I'd like to talk more about different attachment styles within the context of the infant classification. So in the previous video, I've talked about the strange situation and how it can be used to assess attachments in the infant, so 12 to 18 months. And I want to really delve into the anxiously avoidant classification first. This is the A infant. And here, what we're talking about is the infant is actively turning off their attachment system or actively avoiding attachment related content. So, what happens is it's actually the caregiver that's uncomfortable with attachment material. They are uncomfortable with closeness, and in the home, what Ainsworth observed was that the parent would actually pick the child up less. There'd be a lot less snuggling and hugging behaviors. Um, and if you've been around children, it's pretty uncommon to have a child that does not like to be picked up and held. Um, again, I want to, just like in the past, I've said this, that it's usually the child who leads and then the parent follows. So the parent is always responding to the child's needs. Here, with anxious avoidance, when the child is looking away from the caregiver or directing their attention away from attachment material, so say towards toys or towards objects typically, what they're doing is they're responding to the caregiver's rejections of their attachment needs. Um, and what happens is if the child does protest, begin to cry, and show how upset they are, that can actually lead to a worse outcome for the child where the caregiver begins to mock or deride them. Sometimes they'll belittle the child, saying, "Oh, a big girl like you shouldn't cry." And basically, they get punished for expressing their attachment needs. So it doesn't take a lot of repetition for the child to understand that this expression actually leads to a worse outcome. So when you see a child that's essentially directing away from attachment, directing away from these feelings, and from attachment figures, they're not choosing to do this because they like that. That's not their own disposition. It's because it was conditioned that way. So there's something about their experience with the caregiver that led them to pick that deactivating strategy, and they said, this is the best way for me to manage my resources and get the best care possible. Now, the reason avoidance is useful is because they get to be around the caregiver. So it's almost like you're there, the caregiver's there, you get something from having an attachment figure around. You may not have the hugging and snuggling or the active play where you're both co-regulating and co-exploring. You may not get that, but you do have a stronger, wiser person around. And most children prefer that to not having anybody at all or having the attachment caregiver be upset with them and actively rejecting them. So, in a way, you can think of it, you're making lemonade out of lemons. You're softening the blow of this is a very difficult situation. And this option of really suppressing my feelings allows me to get some care, better care than all the other options. And you have to think also at that age, 12 to 18 months, the child is just learning how to walk, just learning how to use language. So they're not really communicating this at an explicit level, it's just internalized at that point. What you'll find later, I'll talk about the adult attachment strategies. When that child grows right from infancy, anxious avoidance, into an avoidant adult, meaning that the classification is actually dismissive, what changes is they actually don't have awareness of their feelings. And it's not an active suppression. It's not that the feelings are bursting in, they're suppressing them. From a very young age, they learn how to deactivate, how to turn feelings off. So there's this natural automation of this process. So when you ask somebody who is avoidant, "Hey, is something wrong? You seem a little down. What's going on?" And they say, "Nothing. I don't know what you're talking about." They really are being honest. Um, so with these um, insecure or conditional strategies, you can think of them as a way to get something out of what's available, right? If secure attachment is not possible and you know your caregiver rejects your direct pleas for comfort, for attachment needs, then you find what is available, what you can do that still gives you care. And then on the other end of the spectrum, so this is the C child, the anxiously ambivalent or resistant child. There, what happens is the caregiver is actually comfortable with closeness, unlike the avoidant caregiver who actively rejects the child and doesn't want to hold them close, maybe uncomfortable with physical touch. The anxiously ambivalent parent, the main issue is gross misattunement. So I was saying this in another video where I'm talking about how the child leads, the child's signaling. If they need something from the caregiver, there's an attachment cry typically, and then the caregiver has to sensitively attune and pick out what that signal means, amplify, reflect it back, and then actually respond to the child in a good enough way so they can settle. What happens with anxiously ambivalent parents or children that have anxiously ambivalent children that have parents raising them? I made a mess of that. Let me restate that. So, right, it's a dyadic measure. You have the anxiously ambivalent child. Most likely the mother, the primary caregiver, is also in a preoccupied state. In that dyadic experience, the mother is often overwhelmed or in a state of their own confusion, their own unfinished emotional business, and there's this feeling of gross misattunement. So if you're in a impartial observer seeing the child may be signaling constantly to the mother, to the primary caregiver, hey, I need help, I need you to come over. And then the parent doesn't actually pick up the signals. Maybe they have 3 objects they're carrying, they're in the middle of something, they're multitasking, they're talking on the phone, they're cooking dinner, and then the child falls down the priority list. So the child may be really actively asking for something and there isn't a timely response or any response at all. And that actually creates this sense in the infant that I don't matter, or my needs don't matter, or I'm not being seen. And it actually ratchets up their attachment system, because when they scream out loud enough, when they signal intensely enough, then on occasion they may get the attachment figure's attention and have their attachment needs met. What I'm saying though is it's not consistent. The preoccupied parent, they are usually not reliable. So the care may be one way at one time, another way another time, and it also is often out of place, out of sync. And then the child essentially is in this elevated state. Their attachment system is hyperactivated. They're signaling more and more to try to get the attachment needs met. And on occasion they do get met. So that positively reinforces this ratcheting up, this cranking up of the attachment system. So you can think of it as if you have, kind of a secure attachment system, it turns on and it turns off. The baseline for it to turn on is, say, whatever's in the normal range, and the baseline for it to turn off is, again, in the normal range. For a preoccupied person, that whole system, imagine just shifting it up. So what it takes to activate the attachment system is much less, because there's this chronic distress, so you're always on. And then what it takes to settle is also much higher. So you're always activated and it's very hard to settle. This is actually the opposite of a dismissive person, where they're almost always off. It takes a lot to get them going, to get emotional content in. So in this way, it's very hard for these children to settle. That's one of the reasons Ainsworth came up with the word resistant. That was one of the descriptions she used for the anxiously ambivalent children. So let's talk about the other category, and this is Mary Main and Patricia Crittenden's contribution to this system is there were children that were not really a good fit for any of these categories, the ABC, so anxious ambivalent, anxious avoidant, and secure children. There was also a group of children, and remember the original studies were done in low risk samples, so middle class, white, no known abuse in the families. They tended to be normative. So there weren't a lot of children that displayed conflict behaviors or had unusual patterns. There was a small amount of them, and obviously as you learn more about this work, you'll realize this category I'm about to describe is the most important category to be aware of. So the contribution Mary Main and Patricia Crinden made is that they were able to find children that had conflict behaviors, and they classified them as disorganized. Originally, the term was disturbed or disoriented. These children seemed to dissociate, or they had moments where they would say have their hands up towards the caregiver or while actively looking away, not making contact. That would be an example of conflict behavior. Or they would rush up to the caregiver within arm's reach and then freeze and go into a freeze state. Again, that would be a conflict behavior where the caregiver is the source of fear. That's one possibility. Or the caregiver just can't meet the child's needs. And these conflict behaviors, once they were able to pick them out and identify them, they pushed them into this category called disorganized. What that actually means is that you have both a hyperactivating strategy, like the anxiously ambivalent, the more preoccupied style, and simultaneously you also use the deactivating strategy, so like the freeze, the dissociation. Together it really creates this external sense that the child is conflicted. They're not able to have their needs met. And again, just like the previous conditional strategies, this is a result of the care that's available. So the caregiver themselves may be in a freeze response. If you watch the strange situation with the disoriented children, what you see is that often the mother is also out of it, just in a dissociated state, not able to attune carefully to the child, and the child tries to get her attention. I want to just say that the level at which this happens is much more severe than just the anxiously ambivalent, the preoccupied experience. This is really a major disconnect here. Another thing that children may show in this category is they're actively frightened of the caregiver. Children sometimes will create this fake smile, so they'll so in the strange situation, one of the scenes is where the mother, the first reunion, for example, where the mother comes back in that scene, the child may have a preference to the stranger. So this researcher who really has no connection to the family or the child may actually feel more comfortable and have a preference for the stranger than to the mother that's coming back. One other behavior that can be seen is children may present in this fake way where even though they're displaying fear or distress, when the mother leaves the room, when they come back, they're over bright. They put on this fake smile and say, "Yes, I am happy to see you." So there's a lot of things that aren't so straightforward once you end up in this category. And again, I want to say this is the most important category for attachment repair because that's where most of the difficulty happens. So the organized categories, you're pretty much able to go about your life and function and have a job, have friends, be able to do things in the world. When you cross the line into disorganization and you don't have a go-to strategy, that's what really disorganization means, is you're using multiple strategies. It's really such a drastic drop-off in ability to function. So the People in that category often have a hard time getting out of the house, have a hard time maintaining work or maintaining any relationship. So I'm talking about one or no relationships at all. There's a lot of isolation, there's a lot of hiding. So this is really a much more severe presentation. And coming back to attachment as a dynamic, one of the things here is that this type of behavior is the child's adaptation to the environment, to the care that's being provided. So if the caregiver is sensitive enough and they're able to attune and have a good match to the parent, to the child, back and forth, that leads to a secure outcome. Obviously, all children are different and all parents are different. I'm in a parent group where we have these meetups where there's a lot of young parents, and it's always so interesting to see how many different children there are. Every child has a unique disposition. Some children are very outgoing, or some are very physically energetic. Others are more quiet or shy, more subdued responses, more chill. And in the same way, the parents are also so different, so unique. So you can have this, you can think of it as, if the match is good enough between the caregivers and the child is going to have secure attachment because their needs can be met. And occasionally, say one sibling may have much better care because their unique disposition, the way they are, it's very easy for the parents to care for them. And then another sibling is, say, the first child is very calm and very passive. They don't need a lot. The parents are able to meet the needs of that child really well. And then the second child is really energetic, really wild, and wants something different. And then maybe that's a challenge for the parents. So in that scenario, you could have two different attachment outcomes. Generally speaking, most families that have the parents are secure, the children are going to be secure. If the parents are insecure, the children are going to be insecurely attached, barring some other major life circumstance like divorce, illness, immigration, poverty, socioeconomic changes, and so on. And the reason I keep talking about infant attachment and all of these categories in infancy is because all those original studies with Mary Ainsworth and Mary Main, eventually they became longitudinal studies, and many of those families were followed over a lifetime. And what they ended up finding was that these early strategies, so you could assess at 12 months, and then you could assess at 18 years old into adulthood, they largely persisted, especially secure attachment and disorganized attachment. Those categories tended to be highly stable. With dismissal and preoccupation, some of those children ended up shifting into security or shifting to a different attachment style. So there was more variability. Overall, though, the takeaway message is that attachment strategies tend to be highly stable over a lifetime of an individual. And not only that, your attachment style is typically passed down from your caregiver. So if you were to figure out what your attachment style of your parents is, you could even go back to your grandparents, and then your own children. They tend to follow a direct line. It's not 100% correlation, but there's enough stability that you can have a pretty good guess as to what your attachment style is, based on knowing your own attachment style, what your parents' attachment style is, and likely what your children's attachment style will be. And lastly, I just want to say that all of these things, as we were talking about it, it's not so much that the child or the parents are choosing to behave a certain way. Remember, by 12 months, these behaviors are internalized. They're really at an automatic, unconscious, procedural level. So neither the parents nor the child chooses to say, I'm going to be securely attached and I'm going to behave in a secure way, or, insecure or disorganized, whatever it may be. It's really just everybody's doing the best they can with what's available out there. So if a secure outcome was possible, that would have happened. If insecure outcomes were only thing available, that's what ends up happening. One thing I want to bring up in terms of attachment, the attachment system, is how it relates to emotional regulation. Remember, secure people tend to have pretty good emotional regulation capacity. They're able to settle quickly. When they get activated, they can feel the feelings. They can use their own strategies, meaning their own autoregulatory strategies. And they can use peers, partners, family, friends, so on, to co-regulate. Where have you ever called somebody or hung out with somebody, or just being around them, 15, 20 minutes goes by, next thing you know, you just feel a whole lot better. You might have been having a hard time, your day didn't go so well, and then you just feel better. You don't even need to go into the details of what happened, what upset you. So that's co-regulation, two bodies and minds regulating each other, or it could be a group, a large group. So in terms of emotional regulation, the main things to know are co-regulation, so that's two people or more. Auto-regulation, where it's one person regulating themselves. When I say auto-regulation, that could be pretty much any behavior, like sports, could be afflictive behavior like substance use or gambling, risk-taking. So there's a huge amount of emotional regulation strategies, how you carry them out, playing guitar, playing music, listening to music. There's really no kind of this is the strategy to go to. People can use all kinds of things like watching Netflix, and some people could go out for a walk and use a walk to regulate. And one thing that can get confused when we're talking about emotional regulation is the difference between emotional regulation strategies and exploration. So the vast majority of people I work with are in a dysregulated state chronically, meaning that their attachment system is always on. They never fully settle. When the attachment system is on, the exploratory system is off. It's very hard to explore when you're distressed, and most people here probably know this. The more dysregulated you are, the harder it is to make sense of the world, the harder it is to say, you know what, I'm going to go on a huge trip or really learn something new or take the world apart. Your own dysregulation gets in the way, and even if you do try to do it, it's very hard to do. So first you need to re-regulate, turn the attachment system off. We need safety in order to venture out. That's the paradox of attachment. And then once we do settle, we can explore fully. With emotional regulation strategies, one thing that can happen is as you grow from infancy into adulthood, and especially later adulthood, emotional regulation strategies can look like exploration. For example, a lot of people I work with may do things that sound and look like exploration. For example, going on extreme sport adventures, really hitting massive exhaustion and doing all these elaborate trips. And when you listen to it, the idea there, you can hear the differences. It's more about trying to get into this adrenaline exhausted state where you just pushed yourself to the limit, to the max, and that allows your mind to turn off, the body to essentially numb out and to feel settled. I don't know if anybody's had the kind of runner's high experience. It's something like that. And I'm not saying all people that do this are auto-regulating, or or sometimes it can be exploration. Of course, some people explore it. The difference is in how you describe it, what's happening. So when someone describes it as, I did that and it meant so much to me, and there was a lot of interesting things about this experience, and you can tell they're taking a lot of information as opposed to just being in the process. This is how it made me feel, and Once I got this exhausted, I just felt this, my whole body relax and get that relief. If that's what you're going for, then it's an emotional regulation strategy. So even Netflix can be like that, where you're watching a show or reading a book, for example, where you're very interested in the content and you're exploring it, as opposed to I numb out and I turn on the screen and I could watch for hours and hours and I hardly even take in what the show is about or what the book is about. It just helps me space out and to relax. So that would be an emotional regulation strategy versus an exploration. So I hope that distinction makes it clear. Coming back to the anxiously avoidant children, I've already mentioned this. They primarily use auto-regulation strategies because the parents, the caregiver, the primary caregiver, isn't able to feel comfortable with closeness or co-regulate for whatever reason. The child learns that this kind of interaction is a no-go, this kind of interaction where it's more parallel, right? You're close by, but you're not looking at each other intensely. There isn't so much attunement and co-regulation happening. That's okay. And also within that, I can do pretty much whatever I want. I can play with toys, I can look at objects, and so on. So then you begin to develop a repertoire of parallel play. So there may be other people involved. And then the interaction isn't so personal. It's not so close. There's this distancing feeling. And also with the objects and the play, it's almost like a pseudo play because you don't really share it with the other person what's going on. And you can think of it as an auto-regulation strategy, right? You're essentially in your own bubble. The other person, your bubbles aren't overlapping so much. So all of this is a type of avoidance strategies. And distancing is a big part of this strategy, deactivation, suppression. And one thing about avoidant attachment that I want to mention is that when these children or adults, if you were to actually measure their distress levels, because there's ways to do that experimentally, there's research on this, is that anxiously avoidant children, even though they appear settled, they don't show a lot of emotion, they seem to be playing. When you measure their saliva cortisol levels or the electrical currents running through their skin, they tend to have actually high levels of stress and anxiety. And if you were to ask them consciously, are you feeling anxious at all? They will tell you, no, I'm not. I don't know what you're talking about. And that will actually be accurate from their conscious perspective because all of that experience is being suppressed. One thing I want to do now is just explore what it would be like within your own life, within the kind of household you did grow up in. What would be like to look at different attachment outcomes? So if you're sitting in a chair, you can go ahead and get comfortable. We'll do a brief exercise, maybe 8 to 10 minutes. So go ahead and settle in. You can just get comfortable. Let your awareness rest on the rhythm of your breathing. Okay, so let's begin. So imagine yourself being transported to your childhood, just bringing to mind a typical scene of your childhood. And when you're there, imagine your caregivers, whoever that may be, parents, aunts, uncles, whoever your primary caregivers were. Imagine them there in the scene with you. And now that you have an established sense of them there, imagine acting securely. What I mean by that is you can just imagine yourself expressing yourself directly. If you have a need, you just express that need clearly. If you feel something or have a thought, you don't need to hold back or hide anything in any way. Just being simple and direct. So really imagine yourself doing that and see how that plays out. Good. Now make a clear note of that. And then when you're ready, let the scene play out the way it actually used to play out in your childhood. Okay, good. Making a note of that too. And then typically what you notice is that whatever ways you behaved, say you hid away in your room, or you were vigilant about your parents' state and maybe had to actively help them and take care of them, making sure they're in their functional. Whatever that was, just get a sense of it, and likely the secure behaviors would not be acceptable. They wouldn't actually lead to a better outcome. So as you have those two scenes, the potentially secure scene and the way it actually is, take a moment now to contrast the way the two different scenes played out. Good. Make an impression of that. And then when you're ready, let that fade, finding your way out of there. And we can end the exercise here. So just check in with yourself how that went. And one thing I want people to understand and come to a conclusion is that there's really not much we could have done in our past growing up to drastically change the outcomes. We did the best we could with the circumstances we were in. And I think a lot of people want to be in a different place than they really are. There's this almost aversion to the way they feel or the way they think they are, who they are. And in order to begin this journey to undertake this path of healing your attachment style, to repair it, you have to really just come into where you really are, how you feel, what actually happened, and that's part of the acceptance. And all the other strategies, all the defensive maneuvers, it is a way to dampen the blow and to make that experience more manageable. But it also is a distortion. It makes it so that the past or the present moment isn't so accurate. It may help you emotionally regulate or be able to get through your day. Yet, at some point, you're going to have to accept what did happen and how things were and where you are at now, which secure people do too. They actually have this balanced perspective on who they are, what happened, and their parents aren't perfect. They tend to have empathy and forgiveness, compassion for their parents for being human. And then the reason I'm saying this is, for one, is with avoidant people, they tend to have an idealized version of their childhood. So things were great. My parents were amazing. And in reality, that wasn't the case. And then for anxiously ambivalent children, as they grow up to be preoccupied, they tend to have too much anger and complaints about their parents. So it's almost like the past is wide open and it's constantly pushing into the present. Everything feels fake, it's a lie. And it's really unresolved. So all that unfinished emotional business needs to come into the present moment, and little by little you can work through it. So the course corrections, the distortions are really different depending on what kind of attachment style you use, and then the repair is also based on what happened and how to get back to this more balanced perspective, a more secure perspective. All right, so that's the exercise, and now I want to talk about attachment as a way of directing attention. So you might notice when you're in a room, in a new place, with people especially, there's a certain way you direct your attention. Certain things, or certain people, certain behaviors, or even your own inner experience, it gets highlighted and lit up. So certain things jump out to you, and every person is different in that regard. And so a secure person may have one experience of the room or the interaction, an insecure person may have a completely different experience of it. So you can think of attachment as a way of directing attention. For example, remember, avoidant children tend to direct attention away from caregivers, away from attachment relationships, and towards objects or high value things. So they may walk in a room and notice, oh, these speakers are very expensive and that's really cool. And somebody else may walk in there and totally ignore the sound system and pick out something completely different, like, oh, this person seems really fun and really nice. Um, so you can really feel that the present moment experience, the way you construct your reality, is based on your attachment conditioning. And in the same way, preoccupied people, what they're going to find is in a new environment, they're actually going to be locked on, hyper vigilant of attachment figures. So when you walk in a room, anxious ambivalent child, their eyes, their gaze, their attention will be drawn to people, and they'll actually be locked onto them. They can't move it flexibly. So that's part of insecurity. When I'm talking about insecure attachment, what makes it so challenging is that it's rigid. So when you're activated, you default to these strategies, and you can't really access other strategies. So for example, anxiously avoidant child has a hard time activating and looking towards attachment figures. In the same way, an anxious ambivalent child has a hard time deactivating and moving away from caregivers to independent play. So you can think of, as part of the repair, is the ability to learn how to flexibly shift your attention. Secure children, what they're able to do is actually, when they need the caregiver, they can look to them and cry out, ask to be picked up, whatever they need, get that, settle, and then move on to playing. So there's this flexible shifting of awareness, of attention from caregivers to objects to exploration to their own experience. So whatever it may be, it's there, it's a flow. Whereas with insecure attachment, what happens is there's a certain rigidity. You get locked into a mode of being, and you just go to, I don't know why, but all I'm going to do is just focus on the toys and not look at the caregiver. Or with anxious ambivalence, preoccupation, right? The child may be hyperactivated, vigilant, and locked onto the caregiver and not even notice there's toys in the room or be able to interact with them. So over time, that really limits your options of not only what you can do, but also the information you take in. Common feedback I hear in the attachment repair work is people move to security, earn security. They often say, oh, there's all these new possibilities that I'm noticing. It's almost like they begin to see new things. And the sad part is that they were always there. These opportunities were always available. It's almost like your mind just excluded them or was locked onto something else and couldn't move to other options. And in the same way that the child directs their attention, you can think of that person, the child themselves, can also direct the attention of the caregiver. So not only are they say, an anxiously avoidant child moving their attention away from the caregiver and looking at the toys, right? If you've ever been with somebody like that, if they're not making eye contact with you, you don't make eye contact with them typically. Otherwise, it would be socially awkward or impolite or even aggressive, right? If you're staring at somebody, you've probably all felt that experience where you notice somebody looking at you intently and you reflexively look at them. And if usually you break eye contact at that point. So, in this way, you can think of the anxiously avoidant child moving the attention of their caregiver away from them. They don't want that because if they do, they might be hit with uh, derogating anger where the child is being put down or rejection. So there's this compromise between receiving partial attention, right? They're together, the caregiver child in parallel, not in direct interaction. And then for the anxiously ambivalent child, the child is actually directing the attention of the caregiver to themselves. So then the caregiver is almost invited to say, pick me up, hold me, look at me. Of course, the issue there is that that rarely happens or happens inconsistently. One of the things about anxious ambivalent attachment is that it's actually this inconsistent care, the outcome is much worse than just consistent neglect because then the child knows what the rules are and how all of that works. Obviously, it's a terrible feeling of sadness and anxiety to be rejected in this way. And with children, the reason the emotion is so strong, right, there's this chronic anxiety is because we're all mammals. We, at birth, from birth, we depend on other people, caregivers, to essentially not only protect us, we're completely dependent on them to raise us. It's a life and death um, situation. So, of course, there's going to be very intense emotions. For secure people, the caregivers are reliable enough that they can settle fully. They know they won't be abandoned, they know their needs are being met in a good enough way. So, you have this stable haven of safety, a secure base. You can settle into that experience. Whereas the avoidant child or the ambivalent child, they're in a chronic state of anxiety. They don't know if the care isn't good enough, it's not meeting the mark. So you're always worried about your life. It's that severe. And now I want to talk more about different kinds of behaviors. So, for example, anxious ambivalent children use involving behaviors, meaning that have you ever had somebody talk to you in such a way that it feels like you're caught up? They're making you, putting you in the middle of their interaction. So it's almost like you can't just walk away or you're not free. They're not telling you about something, they're involving you in it. I think one way in pop culture this is described as trauma dumping or oversharing, too much information. And what happens with anxiously ambivalent children is their parents often drop the role of the parent and collapse into a helpless childlike state themselves and expect the child to put them back together, take care of mommy or take care of daddy. So then they can feel better, get the emotional regulation and support from the child. And then once they're back, they pick up the adult role, the parent role, and they can carry on. That behavior of role reversal and helplessness is extremely damaging. The care for the child is meant to be one way only, especially early on in life. As you get older, of course, the role changes. I think most people that have older parents know that people, uh, parents are always older and wiser, and they really fight tooth and nail being taken care of. Even as they become older and less capable, they still want to maintain that position. With anxious ambivalent children, their parents are actually dropping that role of being stronger and wiser. They can assume the child role. From the outside, what this can look like is the child and the parent are fighting for power essentially. In a secure household, it's obvious who the parent is and who the child is, and that the care only goes one way from the parent to the child. If you were to observe a anxious ambivalent child, their household, sometimes it might seem like the child is the parent. The child is taking care of the parent. In extreme cases, what this can look like is where the parent is sharing intimate details of their life, completely inappropriate for a child's age. Say, sharing about their marital difficulties, mommy is hurting daddy, or you're a big girl and you can listen to these issues because you're so mature. So it's very confusing experience where the child almost seems like, well, this probably is good because they're saying I'm mature and I'm able to take that, and of course it's completely inappropriate. And the version of that is extreme is spousification, where the child almost becomes like a surrogate spouse for the parent because they may be having their own issues. So this involving behavior that anxious ambivalent children often experience is especially difficult to overcome later in life. So I think I'll end here. This is still the introduction to attachment behaviors and strategies, more of a deep dive into what the different strategies are for children and infants. And then in this, I want to also talk about at some point later about the adult behaviors and how these infant strategies develop and become more elaborate, more complex, and also the assessment that goes with that. We're talking about mostly the strange situation right now. I want to talk about the adult attachment interview and how these skills, these strategies manifest in adults. So I want to thank you for your attention. And also, if you want to find out more information about this work, upcoming classes, materials, you can go to my website, mindfulattachmentcoaching.com. It's all posted on there.